Welcome to episode number 28 of the Crisis Intelligence Podcast. Today is Sunday, December 14th, 2014. I'm Melissa Agnes, and this podcast is brought to you by Agnes Day. Let's talk crisis intelligence. Hi, Brigitte. Welcome to the show. Why don't you introduce yourself and tell us about what you do?
Well, my name is Brigitte Stock. I've been for 30 years now a consultant to public and private organization, mainly consultant in public relation, intercultural communication, corporate communication. I've been consulting with small and large organizations in the United States, mainly Canada and Europe. What is really my interest, what has been my interest in the past, I would say, 7 to 10 years really has been intercultural communication or cross-cultural communication. This comes definitely from the education I have. I have a master's degree in political science, international relation. And then I went to Paris at the Sorbonne and did graduate studies in public relation. So really what's happening and what has been happening in the past 10 years is to see those two passions, public relation and international relation, coming together under the umbrella of international communication or intercultural communication. I am an accredited public relation professional. That means that my practice and my, let's say, expertise has been recognized by the Canadian Public Relations Society as well as the Public Relations Society of America. And I'm also, let's say, a specialist on etiquette and manners and protocol, which again brings a layer to this expertise of public relation and international communications.
It's fascinating, and I want to touch on a little bit on etiquette later on in our conversation and our discussion. But I think that cross-cultural communications, personally, I think is fascinating. But secondly, I think that it is for crisis professionals, for PR professionals, yes, but specifically for crisis professionals who have to deal with crises on a large scale that reach from one nation to another or can instantaneously go global. This skill of cross-cultural communications is extremely important for crisis communication.
You're absolutely right, and right now what we're seeing with the, let's say, the global environment is a local situation can quickly become a national event or even an international event, and this happens like very, very quickly because of technology, because of social media. So definitely a crisis management professional has to be extremely savvy in intercultural, the different intercultural aspect or cross-cultural aspect of this, of your expertise. And we just have to look, Melissa, at the crisis, like some of the crisis of 2013, to really see how important it is to kind of master those skills when you're working for public or private organization. If you look in 2013, GSK, which is a big pharmaceutical company working in China, of course, and working around the globe, and really got caught in China on a bribery story. And for them, the way they answered this kind of crisis and really on their reputation was to say, well, this is how business is done, let's say in Asia or in China, and coming with those stereotypes. And of course, not understanding really what makes the specificities of China and the culture and the preferences. They really kind of dug a deeper hole for them and really got into a big crisis, and that was definitely very damageable for their reputation. You look also at another company like BP, and the way they dealt with the oil spill in the Louisiana in the south of the United States, and how they dealt with, let's say, the locals, the people there were really kind of earning a living from coming from the Gulf of Mexico, and the thing is how they dealt with those issues really showed a kind of a lack of knowledge of the importance of intercultural aspect in your communication and the way you're dealing with a crisis.
Excellent, great examples. And then even more recently, I'm thinking of Malaysia Airlines. I mean, flight MH370 that disappeared off in the Indian Ocean somewhere. And I'm looking at it. So we have these organizations that have to deal with the crises internationally, and they have to communicate on many multiple different levels and with different audiences and different cultures. And then you also have the culture of the organization. But even if we look at, so for example, Malaysia Airlines MH370, we have a crisis that took place for a Malaysian organization and the Malaysian government on the other side of the world from North America. And then we had North Americans who are, of course, watching the crisis unfold. Some of them had loved ones on the plane that went missing. And we had the impact here on, or the impact of North Americans judging the company, the organization, for their lack of response or for their different type of crisis communication response without fully understanding the culture out there, whether it's the culture of the organization or the culture of the nation, and how that impacts crisis communication. So I don't know if I'm making this clear, but there's two angles to the complexity of the cross-cultural communications. There's the receiver's end as well as the organization's end of actually providing those communications.
You're absolutely right. And this is a good example also of maybe the readiness level that we saw or didn't see from Malaysian Airlines. It's very interesting how things were dealt, and it's very also I find fascinating. Maybe it's a bit a too strong a word, but how there is this kind of gap between the different cultures and the values that are important for the different cultures. And that's where I find that it's so important for organizations to kind of have a toolkit that will help them deal with those crises in a global environment, because more and more this is what we will see, Melissa. We should not hide ourselves or saying, no, it won't happen. Like everything is now right there in the open. And it is clear that the perception and the way people are dealing with those situations are directly impacted by those cross-cultural preferences, if I may say. And it's really very interesting to see how suddenly people are kind of, and CEOs are coming up to saying, hey, we have to be ready and we have to maybe do something. So, yeah.
Absolutely. And, thinking about it, I mean, it's not necessarily global. And actually, don't let me forget, I do have a question for you after this. But if we look at MMA, so the train that exploded in the small town of Lac-Mégantic in Quebec last summer, so about 18 months ago from the recording of this podcast. And MMA is a North American, but American company. And one thing that we saw within their horrendous crisis management was they didn't take the time to realize that the train exploded in a small town and devastated a small French town, very, very, very French town in Quebec. And when they released their crisis communications and their official responses for the crisis, they did everything in English, which was their first mistake because they needed that meant that everybody affected in Quebec did not understand what they were publishing, what they were stating. And then when they got criticized, rightfully, for their lack of putting out a French statement, they then, the French statement that they did eventually put out, it was as if they just put it through Google Translate. It was filled with grammatical errors. Some of it didn't even make sense. So that is not a global crisis. I mean, of course, it was known globally, but that's something that happened close to home. If on a train that was staying within Canada, so it wasn't even crossing borders, and the lack of understanding the culture of where the crisis happened showed a lack of compassion, big time, on the part of the organization. And of course, it didn't show respect and all of that, but it also wasn't effective. I mean, they were very much criticized for this lack of compassion and for this lack of effort in identifying the need to publish in French as well as in English.
And what is again very interesting with the case that you just mentioned is how suddenly they turned towards supposedly professional communication expert who had no background on cross-cultural affairs. So here they were kind of trying to apply a recipe that didn't have those cross-cultural, let's say, specificities. And that's really what I find so not difficult, but we're seeing a change right now, is that professionals are starting to say, hey, when we're dealing with crisis on a global scale, definitely we need experts who are just more than communication expert, but who are crisis management expert with this intercultural or international type of expertise. And it's not so easy to find, I guess, because we're still seeing stories like the story you just mentioned.
Oh, we definitely are. So let me ask you a question, Brigitte. You mentioned social media's impact, and definitely social media and just the online world in general, it's actually eliminated regional crises. So no crisis is regional anymore. Everything's on a global scale because everything goes online, everything gets indexed, it's all findable within the search engines, et cetera, et cetera. So, however, not every crisis, not every crisis needs to be managed on a global scale. It can reach a global scale or a global audience, but not necessarily be managed on a global scale. So in those cases, how does social media, if it does, impact the need for cross-cultural communications on that level?
It's very important to say that we, as an expert in a crisis situation, we have to understand the media because understanding social media is one thing, but sometimes it's not, let's say, the solution of your crisis is not with social media. It's very interesting also, depending on the part of the world where you're dealing with those situations, to see how people are getting their information, how people where do they find information, reliable source of information. For example, the role played by mainstream media is also very important, by news agencies, and then dealing with the social media. It is definitely an aspect, if I may say, that for us is at the forefront of what we're doing right now, but we should really handle it with, again, with expertise. And that's, I find, what is the most important point there is really to understand the audience that we want to reach and where do they get their information from. And then if social media are coming and technology is coming into play, yes, you play it, but you play it according, let's say, to the best practice that are out there.
Okay, good answer. So you mentioned earlier the toolkit for cross-cultural communications and crisis management. Can you elaborate a little bit on what's in that toolkit?
Well, what is in the toolkit? First, what is important is not to wait for a crisis to be ready in terms of your intercultural communication toolkit, okay? You do have to be prepared, and I'm sure you will agree with me on this one, and you have to understand exactly the mission, the goals, the objective of your organization before any crisis happens. You have also very important to understand and to keep, let's say, being informed by the different issues that might arise and might develop into a crisis. And you also need in your toolkit to be able to develop what I would say and you have to be informed. And in order to be informed, it's very important to really go and as a professional to what I would say and what I sent as a tip is definitely to just read and stay informed, and not only on the internet. Look at the different abstract, foreign affairs abstract. Look at theses that are being published by scholars. Just read all the internal documentation that you might put your hands on, and get out of your comfort zone. Because when the crisis will hit, you need to be, how could I say, comfortable in a certain way to expect the unexpected, okay? And this is very important because then, of course, you have to be, you have also to be extremely organized. All the information that you've been able to gather, all the contact sheets on the different people you might have to deal with, all this need to be ready for you and just to grab and to be able to do what you need to do in terms of communications. You need also to have copies of all your important information. You need to have backups of all your files, computer files, because you might have a total system shut down, and then you might have to go somewhere else and in order to be able to access those information. Another point that I find is very important in your toolkit is organizations are surrounded by professionals and consultants that are there to help them. And what I find is often those consultants, and I'm thinking of the public relation firms. I've worked a lot in public relation. I worked with the top agencies, wonderful people, a lot of expertise. But what I'm finding is when there is a crisis, let's say I'm in North America and I have this crisis in Malaysia, for example, the first thing I would do as a public relations firm is to go and hire a local firm in Malaysia to work with me, okay? Which, I'm telling you, Melissa, I don't know if really this is the best way and it's the solution to managing well your crisis, okay? It's kind of the old way of doing things. What I find is really important is to make sure that you're partnering and you have, as part of your team dealing with this crisis, you have people who are expert in international affairs are expert in intercultural affairs. And yes, you can be an expert that has been dealing with various crises, but if you don't have this knowledge and this informed expertise on intercultural affair, then you might miss something. And this, for me, is key in your toolkit, is really to have around the table those experts in intercultural communication, but international affairs. Because as consultant, what I'm seeing and what I've been saying when we hire, let's hire someone in Malaysia or in Asia to deal with this crisis, is that the North American consultant is losing a bit not his power, but all his savviness. He's acting as an intermediary between his client and the local firm. And I don't know if the client wouldn't be, or the organization wouldn't be best served by keeping this North American consultant as a part of that core team, even if he needs to go over there, work on the field with the people, and really bring this information and expertise that he has about the organization. And for me, this is key. Is what I'm seeing is that often we're kind of sending the problem to, let's say, where someone else's backyard, and not really understanding the benefit that we could bring to that crisis that's happening on a global scale.
Okay. That's a lot of stuff in the toolkit, but it's a lot of good stuff. And I agree that you need to have not one organization will have all of the skills required for effective crisis communication in different scenarios. So maybe you'll have all the skills on your team for one type of scenario, but maybe something else will happen where you need to bring in an expert. Maybe that expert is a cyber investigator. Maybe it's a cross-cultural communications professional. Maybe, it can be a number of different things. So I definitely think that, or definitely agree that identifying these needs and identifying the right partners and people that you can consult with and turn to in the midst of a crisis is definitely beneficial to any crisis toolkit. In addition, or actually, well, it's a different question, but I know that when you think of cross-cultural communications, I think that it's obviously very complex. The world is a big place, even though sometimes it doesn't feel so big anymore. But it is a big place, and cultures from North America to other parts of the world and vice versa are so very, very different. So for those people who are listening, those professionals who are listening to us right now, if they're called in to respond, they're on the crisis team for their respective organization, and something happens on a global front, and they need to work in collaboration with or communicate with parties, individuals, stakeholders, audiences at different areas of the world. Mm-hmm. What are the values? One of the things is you have to understand the values of those different cultures, and whether that's an organizational culture or a national culture. So where can people begin? Like, what are the first steps that they're called into this? They realize that, okay, now we're speaking with Asians, and we don't really know much about the culture. We know that their way of communication is different. The platforms they use may be different, et cetera, et cetera. So what are some things that these professionals should identify and understand and determine right off the bat to help them effectively communicate?
Based on a model that's been developed by a training management corporation, there is 10 different dimensions that a professional within an organization has to look at.
Okay.
And those 10 dimensions are the environment, okay? How individuals relate to people, relate to object and issues, okay? Are we in a culture where control is predominant over harmony? We have to understand. The second one is time. How individuals do perceive the nature of time. Because for us, North American, we're very specific when, for example, we want to issue some information at, let's say, 3 p.m. Time is very different and is a different notion. The third dimension that the professional has to really look and get as much information as possible is how people are towards action, okay? How individuals will conceptualize interaction. Am I into doing things, or am I into more being, in front, let's say, of a catastrophe? How are people dealing with that in that culture, that specific culture? The fourth element is, how do people express themselves? Are they, for example, if I issue a press release, what I'm saying in my press release is definitely, it's been checked by legal counsel, it's definitely something that's 100% proved? Or are we dealing with, let's say, what I call a high context environment where there is a lot of things that are not said? For example, if you look at Asia, if you look at some Arabic countries, definitely it's a context where there is a lot of implicit things that are being said. You have to read between the lines. Here in Canada and in America, it's slightly different. The other element that a professional has to look into is the notion of space, the dimension of space, okay? And this, you see it, for example, between that notion is very clear when, for example, you're dealing with a country such as France, where private affairs are staying private. Whatever happens in a bedroom happens in a bedroom, okay? While here in North America, there is a very fine line between private and public, okay? And if someone, and we've seen this lately with a big story unfolding at CBC, if the line is blurred, whatever happened was, let's say, not acceptable for an organization. So this is another type of aspect, of dimension of culture that you have to look at. It's the difference between public and private information. The power is the other. How power is being, how could I say, the relationship, the power relationship is another dimension that your professional has to really understand. Who is taking the decision, how decisions are being taken. Then also there is another aspect, dimension, which is, it has to do with competitiveness, okay? Are we in a culture where people are extremely competitive, or people are more into cooperation? The same thing with individualism or collectivism. This is another dimension also that your professional has to really ask himself question. And as I'm saying, Melissa, there is a model that's been created, so we are not reinventing the wheel here. And finally, we have to see also how people are dealing with change. How in a culture, if, for example, a culture is risk adverse, this is another dimension that we have to take into account. And in there will come, for example, the notion of pride, a national pride, the notion of reputation, okay, and what and this you will see, for example, if we look at the Malaysia Airlines, what we maybe have considered as being unacceptable, the fact that there was no information or very few information coming to us. In fact, maybe it was a moment extremely painful and difficult for the organization that was the pride of Malaysia. And there was a moment where they definitely had to position themselves and what would be needed in order to, again, save, let's say, the organization face. And not in a very demeaning way, but really in a cultural way. So those are basically the dimension that I would say are important for a professional to look at and really to get as much as information and in order to be able like really to deal effectively in an intercultural environment.
It's fascinating, and there's a lot to that list. So so in a crisis that unfolds quickly or happens suddenly, unfolds quickly, and maybe unexpectedly brings in the whole cross-cultural dimension, and maybe it wasn't planned for, it wasn't maybe not planned for in that specific region, whatever the case may be. How, in your experience, can professionals do all of that research, as quickly and effectively as possible so that they can manage the crisis with the most efficiency and effectiveness? So, because that is a lot of stuff, and it's a lot of stuff if you don't specialize in it, and you don't I would think if you don't specialize in a specific region, then either way, there's a lot of new things to inform yourself with. So, in your experience, how do you go about doing that when time is a major pressure factor?
That's where you have to deal with experts in intercultural communication, and that's what I guess what I've been seeing as lacking right now is that people do think that intercultural communication is just like another communication, when in fact, because of all those dimensions, it is pretty hard to really, garner all the information that will be needed very quickly at the tip of your fingers. When you have to inform or brief your CEO, you need to be ready. And that's why I find there is still room within big consulting firms and smaller consulting, let's say, groups to include that aspect of cross-cultural communication within their, let's say, group of expertise. And that's the only way I would see it. The other point, and I'm coming back to what I said, is you have within an organization, if you're, let's say, in charge of communication, you have to open up to what's happening around the world. You have to be constantly aware of the different trends, of the different, let's say, tools that are being offered to you in order to communicate. You have to read. You have to be totally immersed in this global environment. And I guess it asks for some special skills, and that's why I'm saying the importance of having maybe people who are expert in international affairs, because they do love it, so there is no problem. But for someone who comes from a more traditional or corporate background, it might be difficult. So it is an effort. It has to be really done consciously. You have to constantly be on the path of taking training, new training, going and again reading and just being totally informed. Melissa, we're saying at one point we have to turn off our iPhone, computer, and things like that. But the thing is, the truth is that it is. I would say it's the opposite. You have to be totally. Constantly plugged onto sources of information and to help your organization at least identify issues that might surface and then be ready to act and get your professional around you very quickly.
Oh, I agree with that. I mean, it is always nice to unplug personally, for everybody personally. But no, I agree. And that's why there's people like us who are out there and who are dedicated to helping professionals and organizations kind of keep on top of that stuff, because seriously, there's too much to keep on top of these days. Not one person or one department or, one group of people in an organization could really realistically keep their finger on everything that's involved just on risk and crisis management alone. Just that, not even talking about any other dimension or aspect of the organization. So I definitely agree with you there. And you at the start of this conversation, you mentioned etiquette, and that I always find interesting. I find etiquette interesting, but more specifically, I find, the cross-cultural etiquette, I don't know if that's an actual term, but to be very interesting because etiquette changes from one region, area to another. So where does etiquette come in to cross-cultural communication for crisis management?
Etiquette is a layer of that dimension that I've called power. Okay, it is. You have to bring in your etiquette expertise of knowledge, if I may say, is when you're dealing with in a specific environment. You have to understand exactly, very clearly, how power is being distributed within a culture, because this will dictate how you're reacting in a specific environment, okay? And it's very also tricky. For example, you do not want to be too much, let's say, friendly with executives in an environment where there is, let's say, this level of imposition, if I may say, how things are being done. Someone who is at the top of the pyramid is at the top of the pyramid, and there should not be, let's say, a crossover or too much friendliness between let's say, the bottom of the pyramid and the top of the pyramid. For us, North American, we do not work like that. We have an approach that's more on the friendly side, okay? We like to connect with people. We like to really be able to have this kind of, to break down barriers between people. Etiquette is another, how could I say, tool in your toolkit. You have to be, again, when you're doing all your research and you're getting ready for, let's say, being able to intervene very quickly on a global in a global environment, you have to also be aware of this etiquette things. And Melissa, etiquette is more than just which fork do I use. Etiquette is also how all the approach to people, how to get in touch with those people, what's the best way, and all of this is part of etiquette. Of course, knowing which fork or to use is good, definitely, because you are certainly have to know how to deal in certain circles. But the thing is, definitely that's where etiquette is coming in, and you see also, if I may add, that etiquette is an element where, if we have government now using the term business diplomacy. So when we're dealing with diplomacy and would it be business diplomacy, there is all knowing who does what and what are the different, let's say, networks that are there on, but it's also knowing how to communicate in a more, let's say, savvy way or more knowledgeable way. For example, just as an example, the importance of writing letters. Okay, we are here in North America. We're sending emails all the time, which is okay, and it's this. But maybe in certain part of the world, a handwritten letter or a signed letter will go further than an email. So it's all those different aspects that you have to be really knowledgeable and also prepared. And it takes training, and it takes information, and it takes all of this, of course, to be up to par with the best in the world on this point.
Now, do you think that one professional specializing in cross-cultural communications is what people should look for to hire as a consultant or a part of their team? Or is it really a professional who specializes in cross-cultural communications in this, and this region in the world?
I think that because it takes a lot of dedication to be able to really develop an expertise in cross-cultural communication and to be able very quickly to recognize the important element of the different dimensions of culture, I would tend to say it's better to have someone on your team who is specialized in cross-cultural communication, because very quickly that person will be able to brief for any region of the world, okay? 10 top elements that are maybe of importance for let's say, the organization. That being said, Melissa, that person who will be able to brief very quickly a CEO on those various dimensions will rely on experts of certain region to get his or her information. You see, I'm not pushing aside those who are specialized, let's say, for Asia or Europe or South America. No, it's very important. That's why I was saying at the beginning, it's important because they are a source, an invaluable source of information. But how do you take all these information and maybe a cross-cultural communication expert that's dealing with all the region of the world will be able to identify a pattern or maybe something similar between one region and the other region, and then we'll be able very quickly to come with a recommendation that will save time for the organization. So if you're dealing with 3-4 different experts based on the regions, you might at one point lose some valuable time in order to save let's say a situation or things like that. That's why I think that to have experts who are specialized in intercultural communication is better, I would say.
Okay, that's fascinating. So I've heard you speak before about establishing a politeness strategy, and I've got a two-part question. So politeness strategy, first, what is it and how can professionals go about doing this successfully? And secondly, how does a politeness strategy allow or help one mitigate risk?
Okay. Politeness strategy is a term that's being used in the intercultural communication world. Politeness strategy has to do with the relationship between power and distance, okay? For example, if we are in a situation where we have two experts that are equal in power and are coming from the same background, you say that the way they will communicate with one another is different than if you're dealing, let's say, with, I'm just using the example, let's say the Queen of England, okay, and a consultant in, let's say, business or something like that. You see that the difference there will definitely dictate the way you're going to address and deal with the communication. Okay, that's the politeness strategy. And what is behind the politeness strategy is that individuals are extremely sensitive, vulnerable to even a slight violation of the usage of politeness strategies appropriate in a given context, okay? And that's where the expertise come into play, is how will I know, for example, I'm from Quebec, I use a lot of, there is a difference in French between tu and vous, okay, the polite you or the more familiar you. Here in Quebec, we're using a lot the familiar you. Let's say I go to France, okay, I get into business circle, a very aristocratic, let's say, environment, and I start using this familiar you, I will run into problem right there, okay, for sure. And because people are extremely, again, sensitive to those different little things. So we have to be informed. We have to be prepared. And the important thing in there, what I'm trying to say is that the language is at the center of it. Okay? You don't have necessarily to be totally fluent in French to understand this let's say difference, those specificities. But you have to understand the values that are important in France, the history, where they're coming from in terms of language, how do they position oneself to another, in order to be able to really develop the politeness strategy. And this is a term that's been coined. I've been following classes on intercultural communication, and definitely this notion of politeness strategy is definitely a notion, a concept that's extremely often used in intercultural circle. And politeness is how they're are they defining it? It is a discourse strategy, okay? And what it does is when you use it, okay, you protect in a certain way, not your reputation, but it is the notion of social face, is how you're going to be, what type of interpretation the person that you're talking to will have of you. So this is all the politeness strategy. And again, it requires some attention to details, some knowledge that, yes, might come from your cross-cultural expert in-house or consultant, or also might come from any type of information you might put your hands on, and that will definitely help you define the best politeness strategy. You have to be aware of this. It's like when you're going to Asia, it's different than if you're going to other part of the world. Like, you definitely have to be informed, and it is in the way you're talking, or in the way that you're bringing the subject, the topic on the table, that's where the strategy part is important.
I love I like the example of tu versus vous,
yes.
Especially because, well, unless you're either in Quebec or France, or Québécois or Français, then you probably don't even think about that. You wouldn't, probably English people from North America, unless they have direct relationships or have been to Quebec and or France, probably don't even realize how different the two cultures are. They're extremely different. And so it's a simple example, tu versus vous, but it's for me anyways, it's very clear.
And Melissa, if I may interrupt, also what the example you were given about the M&A and how that train crashed in the center of Mégantic, and they came up and with an English press release, then they used Google Translate for the French press release. Okay. Mm-hmm. Often we see it, and this is not only between English and French, it's any type of situation where we have to translate very quickly. Oh, let's use Google Translate. There is always problem with Google Translate. So coming back to the politeness strategy, the audience will notice right away that this has been done, let's say, by Google Translate, because they'll see some nonsense in your press release, and this right away, right at the beginning, will position your organization kind of in a negative way. And that's why it's so important to really, when I say you have to be ready, you have to have the name, the contact sheets for translators, for whatever you need. Maybe you work it by region of the world, but you have to be prepared, because when crisis hit, you have to be very quickly be able to do an informed decision and to brief the CEOs of those organizations and to help them go through this crisis.
You know, it's fascinating. And two things, actually. So first, I'm thinking if a crisis were to strike and it affected both France and Quebec, just because I'm still
Yeah.
thinking about that, I'm
Yeah.
thinking that that press release or the official statement released by the organization would actually, if you published something for Quebec and then published that same release to France, French people would be very, very insulted. You'd actually need even though the language is the same, it's the French language. The cultures are so different that the terms are different. So many differences between both cultures that you actually would have to stop and say, okay, is this adapted for France as well? And which I think I think it's fascinating. And I think that for those who aren't familiar who don't speak French, for example, or who haven't been to Quebec or haven't been to France, you wouldn't think that. You'd think both are French cultures, so one release for both would be okay. Additionally, it's interesting because I was just having a conversation last week with a good friend of mine who's a translator. She's fluent in French, both. She's from France. She's lived in Quebec. She now lives in Western Canada, so she's fluent in English, and she's fluent in German, High German. And she, just as a translator, it was interesting to learn from her how little she finds that organizations value the translation part. Even, I mean, she was telling me a story about a bank. She has a client that's a bank, and they asked her to translate the screens, like the ATM machine screens, from English to French. And the little amount of effort that they put into really making sure that the translation to French was not just translated but adapted. And when she looked at what had been done previously by another translator who apparently was just hired from, somebody speaking French from within the organization was given the task of translating it originally, and she was supposed to translate the additional material. Both translations, well, one translation was filled with errors and had been up on the screens for 2 years. And then when she came in to do additional translation, it didn't flow because now you have somebody who speaks French and somebody who is French, which makes very, very different, makes for very, very different translation. They didn't care that they didn't flow together. And it's these minor, so talking about mitigating risk, it's these minor details that seem very minor, especially for those who don't speak a given language but know they have audiences in a given language. And so they do the translation thing, but they don't do it with the same appreciation, or maybe don't think that it requires a higher level of review and appreciation and effort. Mitigating risk is incorporated into this because now you're talking about insulting and undervaluing a member of your audience, or a part of your audience, not even just a member, but potentially a big part of your audience. So the whole language thing is fascinating on so many different levels.
And you're so right, and it's at the core of this intercultural expertise, like because behind language or with language comes values, and comes also how you structure your thought process. So this is extremely important if you have to deal and try to mitigate, as you're saying, risk in your communication. You're absolutely right. And what I'm seeing, and I'm hearing what you're saying, is that at the same time, organizations are still trying to cut corners, like to save money, to save a dime.
Yeah, the most important part of their business.
On translation and things like that. When, for example, you just have to look at what's happening, like when, for example, President Obama travels, or any type of leader travels, they have an interpreter with them all the time. And it's because it's so important in the way you're conveying your ideas and how you will present it to your audience, to the person who is in front of you. And this is key. And that's why I think we are at the very beginning of, not at the beginning, but let's say it's been like maybe 20 years now that we're really starting to look at intercultural communication as a key component of your corporate, how could I say, positioning and or your organization positioning on the world stage. And still today, we're trying, we're going to hire this guy in, let's say, Malaysia, and he's going to help us with that. And at the same time, you're cutting yourself from all the knowledge that you could bring to the table, and also you're kind of eliminating maybe expertise by, let's say, saying interpreters or translators or are not important. There is machines who could do that. You're really eliminating an important aspect of intercultural communication. That's. But I'm seeing it that it's changing, and people are saying more and more that it's an important, because crises are hitting all over the place, and
we're vulnerable on a global scale today.
And I'm just looking at the mining companies in South America, for example, suddenly are dealing with environmental issues. Okay, and they're saying, well, it's in South America, in a country over there, but what do they know about that country, and what do they know about the stakeholders over there, and how damageable it can be for their organization not to take this seriously and to do what needs to be done, and to make sure that you have around you those experts that can definitely guide you. Yeah. It's really a question of guiding those organizations on the world stage.
I completely agree. So for the students who are listening, or even for the professionals who are now discovering that they have potentially a passion for this type of specialized communication, where and how can they start to, I mean, are there some really good books out there that'll give them an introduction? What should they follow if they are students? Maybe specific courses that they should follow in school? How can people educate themselves further on this topic?
Well, let's say if you're a communication professional, I would say get out of your comfort zone. Start reading international politics or international affairs, textbooks, or whatever you can find. Also, look at the big trends. What right now? I was just reading yesterday about the notion of post-consumerism demographics. Okay? Mm-hmm. And this is the notion that a company in the UK called Mega Trending is kind of bringing on the table. But what it says is basically things are not necessarily the way we think they are. Okay? And we have to be constantly able to juggle different notions that we thought were like a given, and to always put things back into perspective and being able to be mentally flexible. So what I would say to those students or professionals is read. Watch shows, whatever that is not necessarily related to communication, if you're a communication student or expert, but are related to international affairs and cultural affairs, because the notion of culture is at the core. We talked a lot about communication, but culture in itself, it's so vast as a topic. Like, you have to get out there and take some classes into sociology, into politics, into even diplomacy, or maybe learn a new language also. Like, we're there, we speak French, we speak English, but what is it like? We have to be open, we have to open ourselves to all those different influences that are coming to us through new language classes, whatever we can do. But we have to be like sponges. That's what I would say.
I love that answer, especially because there's a lot of self-education in your answer. And I'm a big fan of self-education. So thank you for that.
And Melissa, it's free. You just have to look how technology right now is bringing education at a new level. Like you look at those massive open online courses that are being given all over the world for free. You just need to have it's given a computer, but still, like there is so much out there that you should definitely show some openness and just get out of your comfort zone and try different things and just go for it. And follow your intuition also. It's very important. Often as expert and professional, we follow those methodologies and models and things like that. But at one point, and I'm sure as a crisis management expert, you will know that your intuition is extremely invaluable, because then suddenly there is something there that you see that, oh, maybe I should pay attention to this. And even if it's not proven, just pay attention to your intuition and just go for it.
Awesome answer. Brigitte, it's been a pleasure chatting with you about this. Where can everybody find and follow you?
Well, the easiest way is to send me an email, bstock@stockmedia.com. Also, I'm on LinkedIn under Brigitte Stock. I have a blog that deals about etiquette and good manners stuff. It's on the lighter note, but it's always fun. I've been having this blog since 2006, just dealing with all kind of situations that I find are of interest for anyone who is looking into etiquette, the etiquette layer of the intercultural communication.
And what's your blog address?
Etiquette and good manners.blogspot.ca.
Okay, so there will be a link to all of these resources and places at the bottom of this podcast, no matter where you're listening to it from, the Crisis Intelligence blog at agnesday.com, iTunes, or Stitcher. Awesome. So thank you so much, Brigitte, for taking the time to have this really, really important and very interesting conversation with me.
Well, thank you very much, Melissa. It's a pleasure to be able to talk about this, because it's been a passion of mine, and thank you very much for giving me the opportunity to share part of this very important topic.
Thank you so much for tuning in and listening to this week's episode of the Crisis Intelligence Podcast. I release a new episode every Sunday, so if you haven't already done so, be sure to subscribe to the Crisis Intelligence Podcast over on the Crisis Intelligence blog at agnesday.com/blog, or on iTunes or on Stitcher. And while you're at it, head on over to iTunes and Stitcher, and would really appreciate it if you left us a review and your feedback. You can also follow me on Twitter at Melissa_Agnes. And if you'd like to reach out to me to ask me a follow-up question from this week or a past podcast, or if you'd like to discuss the possibility of having me come and speak at an upcoming event, then you could email me directly at magnes@agnesday.com. Thanks so much for tuning in this week, and I look forward to talking even more crisis intelligence with you next Sunday.